morning, subscribers. So while I drink my 0400 coffee, I'm going to read this article to you from the Substack of J.Y.Sexton, a historian and writer that I've been enjoying the work of recently. The fascist cult of masculinity is one that seeks out and recruits insecure white men in particular. They'll use any gullible fool, quite frankly, that they can get a hold of, but to be their little useful idiots. And let's get into the history of that. The Fascist Cult of Masculinity by J.Y.Sexton. The history of the right is a history of weaponizing insecure men. What we're watching is a troubling portent of what's to come. The promo was quick to go viral. It had been orchestrated intentionally to capture the attention of liberal and left-wing pundits, to prompt them into sharing the advertisement while deriding it. By the end of the day, it had made the rounds on social media, leaving people wondering what in the world Tucker Carlson was doing with his, quote, end of men, unquote, special. Because we live in this moment of ironic detachment, the majority of discourse surrounded the absurdity, and jokes were abundant. But what got lost in the fray is that Carlson's program and his mainstreaming of this rhetoric surrounding, quote, masculinity, unquote, and its, quote, crises, unquote, is part of a larger ideology and movement. It seems absurd because, well, it is, but also because the larger population is not steeped in far-right circles or their cesspool of neo-fascistic ideas and narratives. If you watch the video above, and you should, the laughable components, including testicle tanning and cliché clips of men chopping wood, wrestling, and grilling meat, conceal a larger and more insidious message. In particular, the words, quote, cycle, unquote, and, quote, order, unquote, betray the origins of all this. Carlson has already revealed himself. After it was discovered his head writer, Blake Neff, was not only a racist troll, but that he actively trafficked far-right stories onto the Fox host's primetime show, it was quickly obvious that Carlson was fully engaged in communicating white supremacist, authoritarian rhetoric to millions. He has openly broadcasted conspiracy theories like, quote, white replacement, unquote, that have inspired terrorist violence. In traveling to Hungary and airing a week-long propaganda program touting Viktor Orban and his illiberal regime, Carlson prepared his audience to accept an oppressive state in America. There is no question what Carlson believes or what he wants. This End of Men special is part of a larger worldview that is being peddled by the right in order to lay the foundation for a drastic change. It is about preying upon insecure white men and weaponizing them in order to claim power. Useful idiots, in other words. And unfortunately, we've seen all this before. An under-discussed aspect of fascism is its reliance on masculine insecurity. The story of authoritarianism is built on the foundation of creating a base of men who feel weak, powerless, and alone, and then co-opting that insecurity in order to fuel a large and violent movement. To this end, fascists construct a theater of aggressive overcompensation, including a worship of violence and death, in order to project to the world a sense of dominance and strength. At its heart, though, is nothing but weakness. The origins of this theater come from a clash between ideologies. Currently, and fleetingly, it must be mentioned, we largely live under a liberal ideology that relies on free and fair elections, representative governments, and an emphasis on multicultural tolerance under the protection of the law. Liberal democracies rarely live up to these tenets, largely because entrenched power acts upon the systems, but the principles are what determine the battle lines. Authoritarians and conservatives, birds of a feather, seek a return to hereditary systems of power that bypass liberal democracy altogether in order to install, quote, rightful, unquote, rulers who will lead through an emphasis on, quote, natural, unquote, laws, or rather laws that prioritize the powerful through the lens of ideology or religion or mythology. Since the advent of liberalism in the 18th century, conservatives have desired to destroy it. We now live in a moment where that battle is reaching yet another fever pitch. Men like Steve Fat-Ass Bannon and the authoritarians they traffic and work with are organizing an international movement that gains ground by the day as leaders in the liberal democracies pretend that everything is fine. Their appeal is couched in a need for the reestablishment of patriarchal power, religious orthodoxy in the form of evangelicalism, and a rebirth of nationalism in the face of neoliberal globalism. As was the case in the early 20th century when fascism and Nazism asserted themselves, these authoritarians now make the case that liberal democracy has failed. This accusation is not without merit. Neoliberalism has so tilted the scales in favor of the rich and powerful that liberal democracy itself has been almost totally corrupted. Meanwhile, the authoritarian movement has used this corruption to their benefit, spreading their poison through the financial and political systems in order to plot the conquering of the system to their own ends. Authoritarianism offers a terrible solution. After having framed liberal democracy as, quote, weakness, unquote, and susceptible to plots by, quote, shadowy cabals, unquote, always, 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 an echo of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories about, quote, Jewish puppet masters, unquote, authoritarians promise the only means for an address of grievances and to right the system is to destroy liberalism itself through the strength of men willing to commit violence and take control. A necessary component for this strategy to take flight is the perceived emasculation of men, leaving them willing to join these groups and efforts in order to bolster their flagging masculinity. And at the tip of the spear, authoritarianism relies on, quote, strong men, unquote, to guide these movements and prescribe for these men in, quote, crises, unquote, an example they must follow in the promise of strength and control through violence. Once upon a time, images of Russian dictator Vladimir Putin, riding a horse and engaging in, quote, outdoor activities, unquote, shirtless, was similar fodder for laughs. It was ridiculous. It was pathetic. It was an obvious matter of posturing and reeked of overcompensation. The truth is that all of this is ridiculous. Masculine insecurity is so see-through, except for men who are lost in the mythology. To them it is deadly serious, to the point that if they feel emasculated, they are more than willing to pick up a gun or clench their fists and literally kill. Strong men are a necessary component of authoritarianism. It is through this pageantry of performance that they establish their legitimacy as conquerors. By casting liberal democracy as weak, after all, the only answer is strength. The performance of masculinity gives these aspiring authoritarians a claim to position themselves as the antidote. There's a long history here filled with dictators performing some of the most absurd masculine tropes imaginable, whether it's riding a horse, or donning a military uniform, or posing for pictures and videos while firing weapons of war. At the heart is a long-held belief in conservative circles that only strong men of destiny are capable of staving off disaster. In the Carlson video, the emphasis on a, quote, cycle, unquote, is telling. It is a reiteration of a deeply held belief in right-wing circles that history, politics, and human societies work in cycles that are predictable, particularly in regard to the ascent of regimes and their eventual collapse following periods of degeneracy. This theory, as most of their ideas go, traces all the way back to Greek philosophy. They believe America is in decline because the cycle has led to degeneracy through multiculturalism and individualism, all of these being natural side effects of liberal democracy. The right has long believed that these cycles are not only predictable but alterable. Liberal democracy keeps the cycle churning and pushing us towards disaster and apocalypse. But if a man strong enough to resist these forces were to emerge, then the collapse could be avoided. This was posited by Niccolò Machiavelli and a whole throng of theorists. It also, for the record, was the belief of fascists and Nazis, who believed their beloved leaders were men of destiny who could wrench their societies away from the cyclical collapse through the destruction of liberal democracy. Authoritarians like Steve Fat-Ass Bannon continue to push this concept, sometimes through embracing ideas like The Fourth Turning, an influential book by Neil Howe and William Strauss. Fat-Ass Bannon and others have embraced these narratives and the need for a resurgence in power through dominance. It's necessary to point out that some of these things indeed work in cycles. Fascism and Nazism told the story of liberal democracy being dominated and manipulated by shadowy forces, more specifically a Jewish conspiracy, to the point where the processes were no longer workable and needed destroyed for preservation. Huh? To justify the violence and anti-democratic actions necessary to dismantle liberal democracy, they pointed to, quote, degeneracy, unquote, including multiculturalism that, quote, diluted, unquote, national culture, tolerance of gays, and the threatening of gender norms. All the while, they spotlit vulnerable communities, accusing them of intentionally engaging in the conspiracy to destroy the nation, while promising their members and power base to rein them in and destroy them. Once more, we are seeing this take place. The GOP's war on the LGBTQ community, the slur of, quote, groomer, unquote, and the politics of conspiracy theories is a replay of past authoritarian tactics. They're already embracing the same playbook and basing their appeals on the same rhetoric. It will get worse. This fetishization of masculinity will play out the same way. For decades, American men have been bombarded with advertising appeals playing off their masculine insecurity, leading to more and more overt and ridiculous compensation through products and lifestyle choices. They are primed to respond to the authoritarian call. We can only laugh at it for so long because this is growing and will continue to grow. How about this one? The cross and the flag, Christian nationalism, and the corruption of history. The right's most dangerous weapon is an intentional warping of our past. Where this has all been heading has been so clear for so very long. The Republican Party's incessant reliance on evangelical Christianity as a worldview has given the game away, revealing that the rollback of the progress of the 20th century would be achieved using the faith as the means and rationale. Eventually, with enough momentum, the usefulness of evangelicalism would mix with the political project and give rise to Christian nationalism. And so here we are. After years of the GOP embracing Trumpism, during which the white evangelical community doted on Donald Trump and treated him as an agent of God or an impure Messiah, we have reached a moment where the political divide is now considered a holy conflict between good and evil. Some of us have been warning about this for years because we watched it grow and form it all the way back in the 1980s and knew what to look for. Others are still trying to wrap their heads around the problem or simply denying it exists at all. Marjorie Taylor Greene, I'm a Christian. How many Christians do we have here? See, I also call myself a Christian nationalist, and that's not a bad word. That's actually a good thing, right? I think that's what your party needs to be about. The crux of Christian nationalism as an existential threat is this. By embracing a politicized faith, the wielders are able to justify any action, any oppression, any act of violence. Christianity, as is the case with all monotheistic faiths, posits that there is only one true belief that is constantly and relentlessly under threat, meaning it has an absolute mandate to defend itself via any means necessary. St. Augustine, one of the foundational thinkers and leaders of the church, called this, quote, righteous persecution, unquote. The concept holds that when the one and true church persecutes others in order to further its rightful ends, that it is justifiable and necessary. When the church is persecuted, however, that is not only wrong, but certain to lead the world astray from God's plan and directly into the hands of waiting evil. This apocalyptic narrative is incredibly useful. It places in the believer an unchallengeable agenda that, if opposed, will only lead to ensured destruction. As this is a conflict between, quote, revealed, unquote, information handed down from God in the form of revelation or dictate, and empirical knowledge, measurable, objective information, even the most obvious facts and figures are rendered moot in comparison. It is, to put it mildly, an airtight and absolute power. Simply put, you can roll back reproductive rights because God wants it. You can destroy all protections for gay and queer Americans because God wants it. You can literally reverse any and all progress, eliminate civil liberties and civil rights, change the entirety of everything simply because you claim that, quote, God, unquote, told you to. This includes representative government, culture, open society itself, because it is deemed, quote, His will, unquote. It is a story that makes a new political reality possible. And the more people who believe that story, and it is gaining traction, and the more people willing to lay their lives and fortunes on the line for that story, and there are many, the more chance there is that the story itself will make significant changes, not just possible, but likely. At the heart of the story of Christian nationalism is a simple and easily disproven lie. To claim ownership of the United States of America, the right must twist and pervert history, turning the foundation of the nation into something it never was. Lauren Boebert. Church is supposed to direct government, not the opposite way. Church is supposed to influence government. Bible says it. Government rests on God's shoulders. Yeah, well, the Bible also said, in fact, your Lord Jesus Christ said, not to have anything to do with the world except what you absolutely have to, like pay taxes. And yet here you are, deeply entrenched in the world's politics. Isn't that interesting? Anyway, many Republicans and evangelicals claim America was explicitly founded as a Christian nation, but this is wildly untrue. The purpose of the lie is to express ownership of the country since the beginning, a twisted version of the stories white supremacists have used since stealing and appropriating the land of Native Americans. In both cases, the fabrication is beyond flimsy. What doesn't get taught in conventional history is that the founders, in addition to creating a system explicitly to protect their wealth and power, also fashioned the beginnings of liberal democracy as an antidote to religious-based society. The revolt against the monarch, itself an institution firmly founded on power through divine right, was part of an ongoing effort to sever the secular from the religious. In fact, the architects of the revolution here and elsewhere labored for years in the shadows, forming secret societies where they could openly discuss the need to move beyond fundamentalist systems. These radicals recognized the dangers all too well. The split between Catholicism and Protestantism resulted in widespread chaos and political instability. Millions upon millions were killed in affiliated wars. Massacres became commonplace. Civil wars, violence in the streets. A literal hell on earth. Even the American colonies couldn't escape the pull. In addition to the witch hunts and persecution we've all become familiar with, religious-based conspiracy theories created bizarre scenarios where true believers carried out calamitous plots, including the so-called, quote, glorious revolution, unquote, of 1689, where Protestants in Maryland overthrew Catholic leadership in an outright coup. For all of the founders' faults, and there are many, one of their true achievements was recognizing the danger of religious based politics and offering an alternative. Liberal democracy, with its laws and institutions, was explicitly intended to replace this old and dangerous system, putting in place something that could move religion from the public sphere. This is about more than just the separation of church and state as a principle. This is the entire basis of liberal democracy as we know it, which is why the right is looking to destroy it entirely. This new push for Christian nationalism echoes previous moments in our history, including the evangelical drive in the 1980s that partnered with Ronald Reagan to radically transform the nation. This iteration, however, is playing for all the marbles. What ideologues are interested in isn't just a Christian regime, but what the story and mythology of Christianity can accomplish. For some, this is about true belief. There are evangelicals who believe, without question and with full faith, that a Christian-based America is necessary should we not descend into a hellish apocalyptic existence. And then there are others, including wealthy donors obsessed with destroying the, quote, scourge, unquote, of democracy itself, who see the faith and its assorted features as incredibly useful in preparing a base of supporters to accept any and all reactionary options. So far, what we have seen is this: a Republican Party that has used weaponized conspiracy theories and Christian apocalypticism to seed radicalism within its base and make possible preemptive violence, oppression, and a range of anti-democratic actions. By using the stories, they can explain a stolen Supreme Court. They can explain rigged elections. They can explain the kind of widespread action necessary to make these regressive plans a reality. And, in the long run, the rolling back of the clock from the start of liberal democracy, which largely began here, to the days of religious-based systems of power in which democracy has been neutralized and entrenched wealth rules over an unquestioned hierarchy. Stories are useful, incredibly so, and hardly any has ever been so useful as Christianity, which has been co-opted and weaponized for centuries. To ignore this now is to turn the other way as this project continues on, and it is absolutely continuing on. That we have arrived here with open calls for Christian nationalism, for Christian nationalist churches to sprout from nearly every corner of the country, for the name alone to be a rallying cry, is an indicator of where we are and where we are going. That's all the reading I got in me. You guys have a good day. Bye.